Okay, it appears as if recording has now started. Thank you to Martin and thank you to Rachel for the introductions. It's quite disconcerting to be talking to yourselves about the history of Leeds when so many of you know so much and write so much about the city. Okay. As said, my name is Andrew Filarowski. I'm Leeds born and bred. I'm actually proud of coming from the city, which is diverse both in its culture and its industry. I heard David Reardon speaking just last week, and he spoke about the diversity of the industries that were here, about the diversity of people. And many historical books on the city talk about 101 trades, which is very true, and is one thing that makes this city great. I'm also one of the diverse range of people who have made Leeds their home through my parents. It's a city that's allowed my parents to thrive and to become what they are today, and thankfully they're still alive. My father came here at the age of 14, having been born in what is now Ukraine, and at the age of 15, on the 6th of November 1950, he joined Hudswell Clark as an engineering apprentice. My mother came 10 years later as a 16-year-old and went to work at Morehouse's jam factory at Old Lane in Leeds, where she was picked up from the supply chain from working counting the tins of jam. Because she could count in twos, which was more than a lot of the people there could do, and she was put in the office. She got the opportunity to learn. She became school secretary at Notre Dame, just down the road there. So the city's giving my family an opportunity, and it's given me an opportunity as well. My first encounters with textiles were ones that I didn't realise. My grandma used to take in sewing from the tailors that were around Beeston at the time and around the whole of the city. And I would sit there with piles of jackets around me and they'd be picked up. My aunties, my uncles, people from the Polish community worked at Burton's. They were pressers, they were machinists, they worked in textiles. I actually joined Marks and Spencer's on Briggate at the age of 14 in the menswear department. I went to school at St Michael's College, just down the way here, the last entrance of grammar school boys to St Michael's College. And taking my A-levels, unfortunately, I disappointed my mother, I disappointed my school, and I disappointed Mr. John, the manager at Marks and Spencer's on Briggate. I was called into my mother, who gave me a severe telling off. The school teachers just threw their hands up and said, "We always knew you'd do this." Mr. John offered me the opportunity to be a trainee at Marks and Spencer's. My mother was appalled, as most immigrants would be. "You will go to university," she said. And a friend of mine from school, his father, Dr. Denton, was a lecturer in textile industries. And they were desperate, absolutely desperate, to be able to keep the course alive, to have somebody coming to join the course. So I got onto the Textile Chemistry course. After graduation, I had various jobs. I took a role at Yorkshire Chemicals. And from that, I became aware of various things, because obviously Yorkshire Chemicals at Hunslet Road were based on Cudbear Street and O'Keller Street. So I knew there'd been connections there for a long, long time. And we'd drive through this with my father. And growing up, I'd drive through Holbeck. We lived up in Beeston. We'd drive through Holbeck, through Hunslet. I'd drive through the centre of Leeds, up Briggate, and out the other end. And coming back, we'd come back through Roseville Road and down over Crown Point Bridge. And I probably still have a vague memory of an industrial past in Leeds. But I never really made an impression on me in terms of how it was related to me. It does work. Okay, now in any history about colour in Leeds, there's two things that for me loom very large. One is Leeds University Colour Chemistry, and this year is actually 150 years of the founding of Leeds University. And the other one is Yorkshire Chemicals, and specifically the names of Wood and Bedford, okay? And Bedford gets a mention occasionally in this talk. It's very temperamental. So why this talk? Why am I here today actually talking about dyeing in Leeds? Well, 10 years ago, this book fell into my hands. I'd never heard about dye works, dye houses within Leeds. But it is, as it says, the story and the family business expanded and revised. I should say I'd never heard of dye houses in the centre of Leeds. I knew about the dye houses on Kirkstall Road and stretching out Sheepscar, etc., etc. Some of them were still going in 1987 when I joined the industry. But this is the story of dyers and dye wear grinders. It provides the history of a dyeing business in Leeds from approximately 1802 to its closure in 1946. The company, as I've said, was involved in dyeing and as dye wear grinders and cutters. Now, one of the first pages gives a description, and this is what really drew me in. It gives a description of where the dye house was in 1802 on Quarry Hill. And as the writer, Edwin Waddington, writes, there they had established a small business at the foot of the hill on the banks of Lady Beck, Adelbeck, dyeing woolen cloths and cutting dye woods, with power provided by water wheels, served by a reservoir 1 acre in extent, adjoining gardens well stocked with fruit trees and vegetables. Now that's not an image I've got of Quarry Hill. I'm brought up with Quarry Hill slums and then the development of Quarry Hill flats. So that started me on a journey. The activities, right. So what's included in the book? There's more than just the typical things that you're going to get in most dye books. This is an elderly gentleman's ramblings, giving details of the actual machinery that's used within the factory. Doesn't give any dye recipes whatsoever. So it talks about the machinery for the dyeing, the machinery for the dye wear grinding. It talks about the wages. It talks about the living conditions and how they've changed over the period in which they've been involved in dyeing. It talks about the changing face of Leeds and the people who are important in that changing face of Leeds. It talks about government interventions. And Edwin really didn't like taxes and the effect it had on the public and on his business. And it also mentions the effects of war on business, mostly having a positive effect. So as I've said, there is no other book about dyeing, either in Leeds or anywhere else as far as I'm aware, which doesn't focus on those dye recipes. Okay, as I've said, there was no dyers in the city centre. Any reference to dyeing in Leeds is always about the pollution. It's never about the actual people who worked there. So this book is quite special in terms of what it does. And there's certainly no other book that I know of which explains the situation of actually dye grinding. And it opens up a whole area of research into international trade, the size of the volume, the sheer weight of the volumes of these dye woods that were around there. But for me, it also opened up a world that's long lost, of Stiander, of Bank and the Leylands, of Fern Island, and in textiles, the importance of Nether Mill. And it stretches back across towards Leeds Bridge, towards the King Mill area, Mill Hill, Isle of Cinder, School Close, both names are used. And I never really realised how important Adelbeck, Meanwood Beck, Carbeck, Ladybeck and Timblebeck and Newtonbeck, all the same becks, all running down towards the River Aire, are actually important. But the one thing that proved to me that dyeing was important in that area of Crown Point is the fact that I found that there was a public house called the Dyers Arms just near there at one point. It's always good when you know the workers have got somewhere to go to have a drink at the end of a busy day working. So this is probably a map of Leeds that you're all very, very aware of. It's a map from 1560. And it'll seem familiar to all of you who know Leeds in any way. There's nothing on there that's really surprising, and the street names are the same. The thing that surprises me is the actual size of Sheepscar Beck and Newton Beck as labelled on there. Now, I know it's not to scale, but I actually think they were much bigger becks than we give them credit for. There's no industry listed on there. There are the houses, and those houses will have been houses of merchants who were already involved in the textile industry. The textile industry was changing around this time, yeah? And really, I've no idea how Leeds became this important area for textiles, because textiles was very much controlled by the guilds and the worshipful companies. And people were allowed to create textiles and to dye things because they were given a royal charter by the royal families. But there must have been a subculture almost of people who were working against that. So in Yorkshire, the areas that had the right to produce cloth and to control the quality control were York and Beverley at the time. Moving on a few years to 1576, I have found the last will and testament or the last goods that were left from the estate of John Pawson of Kergate in Leeds. And within there we have one lead for dyeing cloth. And the fact that it was in the lead house, and the lead house is another name for a dye house, because all the dye baths at the time would have been produced out of lead, or the majority would have been, it appears. I think in some of the better dye houses down in London, we would have had copper-based, copper-lined lead for some of the dyeings. But maybe that's an indication of the fact that this was a fairly crude affair. And what always gets me as well is, if there wasn't a guild, so as an example, the Worshipful Company of Dyer, a guild first existed in London in 1120. And the actual Worshipful Company was formed 551 years ago, okay? So there was a long history of learning the craft of dyeing. In a provincial town like Leeds, where did one learn the craft of dyeing? Okay? But it appears that the clothiers were actually taking some control of the coloration. Because it's obvious from this, because John Pawson has a shear board and 4 pairs of Walker shears, that he was a clothier. He was a finisher of cloth. He was the person who gained most benefit out of a piece of cloth when it got sold. What's interesting, as well as being the finisher, he also has a loom and a spinning wheel. That's industrial. Before, people would have thought it was actually industrial, because everybody really talks about the spinners working separately from the weavers, working separately from the finishers. And yet here we've got somebody who's doing most of the processes within one building. It's interesting, and it needs more examination. In 1587, I also found the will of Anthony or Arthur Whitehead. It does say that he was a dyer, and the only reason I've put it up there is he had two, that should say bast, sorry, rather than last, 2 bast begotten sons to which he was leaving some money. There was scandal in the town of Leeds. So there's very little evidence of further dyeing in any of the maps of Leeds that I can see until we get to a map of 1728. And there we can see Dyers Garth. The river will have been relatively clean at this point, and it's important to state that every dyer, then and now, requires a clean source of water to be able to apply their colour. And they need large quantities of it. So it's not surprising that they were using the River Aire to dye their goods. But my question, and one that I'd really like to find out, was this some type of communal dye house? I can see no evidence yet, but I might find it at some point, that Dyers Garth was owned by a particular person. So it's just another anomaly that seems to occur, because again, nowhere where I've looked have I found anything called a Dyers Garth. So it's something to investigate going forward, but dyeing was taking place. Now, I've got to thank Stephen Burt for this, okay? So by 1751, Stephen Burt, Oates was already importing large quantities of dyestuffs into Leeds, okay? So there we have things like logwood, chipped peach, the sumac is sumac, yeah? We've got Sandoz, we've got ground Sandoz wood, we've got alum madder. The point to make here is, at some point, the Americas were found, and that provided us with lots of dye woods, so peach wood and Brazil wood. Another point of interest here is the country Brazil is actually called after the wood, rather than the wood after the country, okay? Brasa is the Spanish word for ember, and the dye from Brazil wood is red. And so in Spanish, the wood was called Brazil or Brasa, whatever in thingy. And then ultimately it was decided it was so important for trade to change the name of the country. Obviously, the East India Company had set up in India in 1600. And so we also had a massive influx of dyestuffs from India, okay? And there we can see indigo down at the bottom. The influence of those influxes of different types of dye woods is massive. It's absolutely unbelievable. And I'm going to make an assumption here that Leeds could become a centre for dyeing, because the importers of these woods and people like the East India Company, if they could only sell to the worshipful companies or to the guilds in various countries, they had a limited market. They, in some way, were trying to develop a market for themselves, which was out of the control of the guilds. And maybe that had a very big impact on the fact that dyeing took place. There is also evidence that around 1750s, the merchants were taking on board and doing some of their own weaving and dyeing, but they couldn't have done the dyeing within their own buildings. And so there's a change. There's a first industrialization taking place here. These dye woods need to be processed before they can be used. The old simple dyes that the English had of woad, madder, and dyer's broom were relatively simple to process. Suddenly, we had access to large, vast quantities of woods that could colour textiles. I reckon both the dye wood suppliers, merchants, to the dye wood grinders, and to the textiles people, they were growing their market to meet the demand, not of the people, but to be able to use what was being produced. Imagine the size of South America and whole forests full of logwood and peachwood and camwood. They had to create a market for that. Now, Oates was known as a salter, selling dyes, but he also sold other chemicals as well. Now, in my mind, while I can understand that merchants are probably very well educated, and obviously we've got Ralph Thorsby and various other people, I would have always had a thought that the Dyers were a fairly down-to-earth people, and especially in a provincial town like Leeds. Yeah? It's a dirty job. It involves lots of steam. It involves lots of waste. You'd have thought it was a more practical man who was involved in dyeing. And yet, in our archive back at the Society of Dyers and Colourists, we have the original French book, which is from 1765. And in 1780, James Haig, a silk and muslin dyer from Leeds, translates that French book into the English. Unfortunately, I can find no evidence of James Haig existing in Leeds and being a silk and muslin dyer. So there's a quandary there.
Does exist. We'll talk about it later.
I most definitely, because I've searched and searched. So it means that the people being involved in dyeing and setting up the dyeing concerns were obviously from the merchant classes. I've made the wrong assumption at some point, yeah? And dyers are an intelligent breed. We like to think so, don't we, Christine? So, just thinking back, the fact that Brayshaw's Dye Works, as it was called when it was on Quarry Hill, was started in 1802. In 1770, on this map, there's very, very little evidence of any industry around there. And there's very, very little evidence of any industry on the 1792 map. We can see that St. Peter's Square has been built, but St. Peter's Square is built by merchants to try and give themselves a better life. How, in 1802, does a dye house find its way onto Quarry Hill? It's a question that needs to be asked that I need to find out more. But actually, if I look at the various directories that are around, in 1798, I see that there are 24 dye houses in the centre of Leeds, and it grows up to a maximum in 1837 of 51. That's a relatively short space of time for people to be trying their hand at dyeing. And then it drops off very quickly to 1888. Now, is that partly because of the way Leeds was organised? Because it is the city of 101 trades. We'll go and do something, we'll make money from it, then we'll move on to something else. Maybe it is. Maybe it's what's made this city as great as it is and sets us apart from our neighbour in Bradford, okay? Maybe it's because Bradford decided that they wanted the dyeing trade and therefore set up bigger concerns. But actually, it's a good idea not to have dyeing in your city centre, because dyeing does produce a lot of waste, and especially if you're chipping woods and using large quantities of natural dye stuffs, and it produces a lot of coloured effluent. It's not great for your river. So maybe Leeds decided they didn't want dyeing in the centre of Leeds. We'll see. Now, as we move on, we can see that the same thing happens in the whole of Leeds as well. So if you look at 1863, so as I've said there, in 1888, the directory gives dye houses for a much wider area for the greater conurbation of Leeds. So it includes Kirkstall and it includes out onto Meanwood Valley, etc., etc. If you look at other directories, you can see that even on a wider scale, by the time we get to 1903, we've only got 16 dye houses in the whole of Leeds. So it's a relatively short-lived trade. And maybe that's why it doesn't really get mentioned as much as it should do. Because it was important, but it was important. So the first directory is 24. It uses the word stuff, and if somebody can please tell me what stuff is, then please do. I seem to have got to the idea that it's now alpaca rather than worsted, but it could be alpaca, mohairs, etc., etc. But we'll talk later, obviously. Yeah, Greyshaw's is not listed in 1798, which is not surprising. But we have got a company called Chadwicks, are listed as Dyers of Bowman Lane. Now, Chadwicks are actually important in the whole of this, I think. And I've still got some more investigation to do about them. But there's no mention of anybody that relates to Yorkshire Chemicals or the future Yorkshire Chemicals, Wood and Bedford, etc., etc. They're not doing any trade here at the time, at that point in time. Okay. You're going to be able to answer this question as well that I've got on the end of this probably. What I did find for 1810 was William Chadwick's last will and testament, and William Chadwick left £30,000. My question is, did the Chadwicks have interests elsewhere before they were involved in Bowman Lane Dye Works, which then allowed them to set up Bowman Dye Works? Because I think it will give me an idea of who was going into the dyeing industry. It's a lot of money to be had, but nowhere in that will, as far as I can see, does it talk about dyeing. So we'll see what happens. Now, the Chadwicks were very important. Bowman Lane sits just to the left as you approach the city on Crown Point Bridge. And if anybody's ever driven up, is it Black Bull Street, you will have seen a Georgian house there, which is the Chadwicks house. Okay. That was actually built off the profits of the Bowman Lane Dye Works. So dyeing was obviously very lucrative. Now, Bowman Lane Dye Works was quite big. Okay, on that side, you can see Bowman Lane Dye Works. I always make an assumption that a dye house is relatively big because it has separate coloured dye houses within it. So it has a blue dye house, it has a black dye house, it has an indigo dye house. It's also specialising. And I base that on work that I know happened at Ripley's in Bradford, who were the biggest dye house in the world at some point around 1860. So they were big, but they were a commissioned dye house, or what we would call a commissioned dye house now. They were taken in, just like Waddington's were, they were taken in fabric from weavers and then sending it off to finishers. Another dye house around that area was Croysdale's. Now, my investigations haven't established yet, which is at Nether Mills, okay? You can see the number of, I'm assuming that's to represent the dye vessels that they had within the actual dye house. So they had 32, and in a bit we'll go into how many dye vessels Waddington's had, but it was actually 12. So there's a big difference in terms of the volume of fabric that you can dye from 12 to 32. So they form part of my whole investigation into all of this, having started with the Waddingtons. Okay. In the 1817 Leeds Directory, we've got 33 dyers. The whole directory is much bigger, the city is growing, and William Brayshaw has given us a dyer on Mabgate Green. Now, is Mabgate Green just another name for a part of Quarry Hill? It fits close to it, it's just the way it sits. I don't know. But it's actually not listed under the actual list of individual dyers. Again, none of the YCL people are mentioned, but I think it's important to note that the canal is completed in 1816, which potentially determines some things that Waddington's did going forward. Okay. By 1822, Brayshaws have moved to Nether Mills from Quarry Hill. They moved in about 1820. Okay. Potentially because of the effects of the canal. Dye woods would come in down the river and now would come down the canal. And Edwin Waddington, in his book, categorically states that they were getting deliveries coming both from Hull and from Liverpool direct to the wharf at Nether Mills. Okay, it made sense for them to move there because they had a growing dyewoods business. Peachwood, camwood, Brazil wood, or even if you're buying indigo, you're having to buy large amounts of dyestuffs to be able to get large amounts of the vegetation to be able to get relatively small amounts of dyestuffs out of it. It wouldn't make sense to transport those to Quarry Hill if you could have a place on the canal. So that must have played a part in everything that was going on, okay? What I've noticed also in 1822, it's the first mention of a commission warehouse owned by Thomas Rothwell for dye wares. So again, the number of dye wares that are coming into the city is growing. There's an actual warehouse set up to hold them, okay? In 1829, Brayshaw's are still at Nether Mills, and this is where we get the first mention of James Bedford as a chemist and druggist now Briggate at 40 Briggate. Bedford plays an important role in terms of dye manufacture of synthetic dyes within Leeds. And the list of actual dyers is now very specific about what those dyers do. So you can see that people are getting a little bit more specialist in what they're doing. So it talks about stuff dyers, worsted, cloth, wool, cotton and silk, woolen and silk, wool and cloth. So we're also seeing an increase in the number of mixture fabrics that are happening as well. Cotton's making an appearance in some significance, yeah, and we're having mixture dyes. By 1832, William Brayshaw's have now moved. They've moved to their final building on East Street. James Bedford has now become a manufacturing chemist and he's based in Hunslet. And he's marked as a Cuthbert and Orkill manufacturer, okay? But surprisingly for me, on looking around at this, there are also listed other people who are producing Cuthbert and Orkill within Leeds. John and Samuel Carr and Story and Walker. My history of Leeds and of Yorkshire Chemicals was that James Bedford was the only Cuthbert manufacturer in Leeds. It turns out that's untrue. And a little bit more reading behind all this, it appears that a certain Mr. McIntosh from Glasgow, who had bought the rights to produce Cuthbert, which is a very specific way of treating a lichen to produce a range of different colours. He'd purchased the rights to that patent from Mr. Cuthbert of Glasgow, who hadn't managed to make the industry work. And at some point, Mr. McIntosh, whose son later on developed the Macintosh fabric for the coats, came down to Leeds and worked in conjunction with somebody. But it's very tenuous. It appears very tenuous. So it may not have been with Bedford, it may have been with somebody else, okay? And one thing of interest from 1834 is we have Elizabeth Robson, a silk dyer at 33 Duke Street. Okay. By 1837, we've got grinders, dye-away grinders. Croysdales are mentioned at Nether Mills, and it's the first mention of the Dyers' Arms on Garden Street on Timble Bridge. Okay, and Bedford is now producing Cuthbert at Leithley Lane. We also, by the time we get to 1888, we get the first mention of John Marshall at Cuthbert Street. Now, Marshall becomes a partner of Bedford and part of the 11 companies that form Yorkshire Dye-Ware Company. It now lists dyers and cleaners and includes all of Leeds and the surrounding areas. Mr. Waddington is very clear as to why we have dyers and cleaners in 1888. In 1856, a certain young gentleman, William Henry Perkin, developed the first synthetic dye. Mr. Waddington is dismissive of these very first synthetic dyes as not being fast to light or fast to washing, and could not hold a light to the wonders of natural dyes. And therefore we have seen a proliferation of dyers and cleaners of garments, because no more can garments be worn for many years without the need for them to be dyed. And this is all the result of the synthetic dyes. And it's probably true. It probably is very, very true that early dyes were not very good. We have a dye and colour manufacturer of classed as aniline, which is the new class of synthetic dyes, called Dawson Dan Brothers. Yeah. And interestingly, the Chadwicks are no longer at Bowman Lane, but a gentleman called William Kitchen and Company is there. There's no way we're going through all of this, okay? But the important part's going back to Waddingtons and Brayshaws and Waddingtons. So 1802, Brayshaws opened a dye house and a cutting mill, as we've heard already. 1816, they moved to East Street. We've seen that from the directories, okay? And in 1849, James Coote Waddington, aged 12 years, joins Brayshaws. We'll cover that a little bit further, okay? By 1869, James Coote, the son of James Waddington, the original person at Brayshaws, buys the business. His diary entry for April, and I can't read it, I'll read it from there, is very laconic, okay? Which seems to be that James Coote Waddington was very laconic in everything that he did, okay? James, the original person, dies at the age of 70 in 1872. And it's back, it just needs to move. Okay. And in 1881, the company moves to Crown Point Yard. In 1909, James Coote dies, and in 1942, Crown Point Dye Works closes. That image is up there. That image was allegedly taken in 1954 at Richardson's. It's from Leodis. If ever you've been onto Leodis, you can search and search for time immemorial, and then suddenly something pops up and just makes sense to you. Going around and finding that and seeing the barrels there, I knew Richardson's were a dye-ware grinder. Okay, this really gives an idea of what happens. There were three main elements in treating dye wood. There was crushing, which was used for cochineal and for lac. There was grinding, and there was rasping, and I'll cover those hopefully a little bit more. Okay. So this is a description of, so the other thing that's interested me is, when did people start working? Yeah. And I'd have had the idea, if you're the head dyer at a dye house, your son might be going to school, you know, he'd be having an education of some sort. By this point, the Waddingtons are living in a quite nice house. They're just about to move out towards Chapeltown. But then Edwin writes this: how his son James Coote came to be a dyer was revealed just as we heard it from him, is tinged with a bit of domestic flavour. Grandfather, home from a busy day, sat in front of the fire after tea, reading a newspaper with a candle between the news and himself. The rest of the room in darkness, as no gas was laid on, was interrupted by Grandma calling out. And I really want to do this in an Alan Bennett voice, but I don't think I'll manage it. Let's have a bit, and it's his birthday today as well, so that's going to be quite good. Let's have a bit of light. Leave your reading, as I want to ask you something. Agreed, and our Grandma, whom none of us ever saw, started. Isn't it time our Jim was working at East Street? Why not arrange it with Brayshaws? Well, he said, it's such a trashing job. I'd just as soon hang him. But yet, James Coote, at the age of 12, left work at the pawnbroker's shop to join his father in the dye house. And his father was the head dyer. I find it amazing that a 12-year-old would have the strength to deal with the dye woods, the amount of water, the sheer weight of fabric, not just dry fabric, but wet fabric, to be of any use in the dye house whatsoever. But joining a works at the age of 12 must have just been typical. The book goes on and talks about various processes, and it gives us a wonderful tour through the first dye house, two dye houses. It talks about 2 oval pans, and it talks about 8 square stone troughs, which were used. It talks about it taking 3 people to work one piece of cloth. Work started at 6, father having left home at 5:40. And it carried on until it was finished. If they were lucky, they could get 2 pieces out of each dye bath. Every piece of fabric had to be inspected under an open, or in the open air, before it was put into the washroom to remove anything that the weavers had put on there. And then, by trolley, sent over to either the oval pans or the stone troughs, where initially a fire would be lit under them, the temperature raised, the dye stuffs put in, always overseen by the head dyer in an office, and worked by one man stoking the fire, one man turning the handle, and one man opening the fabric. It's the only description that I've ever seen of how people actually did it. And I think there's a lot to be said about technique. Edwin also talks about the technique of dyeing curtains for Luptons, who were selling those curtains to Queen Victoria for Windsor Castle. And he talks about his father having the technique of combining these 2 dye stuffs to make a dye stuff that was fast to light in a room that was bathed in sunlight for much of the day. So I think there's a lot we can learn from looking at all these things. What Waddington does state is that men initially worked in the dark, and he has no idea how they worked within that darkness within a dye house. He does turn around and say, though, that many a worker stayed with them for a long, long time. The work was dark, the work was hot, and the work was humid. But given the conditions of the atmosphere outside, it was healthier in the dye house than it was outside on the street. And never a man took ill or suffered from bronchitis, he writes about, which I just find, is that a boss's view of things, or is it, or is it a truth? Okay. So there was grinding, there was crushing, as I said beforehand, okay? The same image that we had before. That was what was used for crushing cochineal and lac dye, okay? Now, the sheer size of that indicates the sheer amounts of dye stuffs, the amounts of matter that was being crushed to produce a relatively small amount of dye stuffs. Grinding was done on things like turmeric, sumac, myrrhboans, sassafras, and argon, okay? They're words that I could go into and tell you what colours they produced, etc., okay? But that produced a fine powder by grinding. The description in the book talks about a wheel that is 20 foot in diameter with rasps on it, used for rasping the wood. Now, you only produce something that's 20 feet in diameter with lots of rasps on it if you're rasping a heck of a lot of wood. Yeah? This was a serious, serious concern. And it happened in lots of places. Okay? So natural dyes used a heck of a lot of natural material. Okay. And with the dye woods, which were usually chipped, but could be rasped as well, were logwood, fustic, peachwood, camwood, barwood, and sandalwood. Logwood also had to be aged. And if you were a dye grinder, you had a special room in which you laid out your logwood. And as the logwood oxidizes to release the red dye stuff or to change the chemical inside it towards the dye stuff, it's an exothermic reaction. And allegedly it was all hands on deck with everybody involved if the temperature got too high. Now, we do have evidence, I do have evidence of this being done at John Marshall's flax mill in Shrewsbury, which ultimately was used for other things as well. But if you can imagine, there was a lot of heat generated if these rooms weren't made with metal in them. There must have been the potential for fire in all of this. Another important part to sort of quickly mention here is that I assume that most of the dye houses followed the convention of having metal in the roof structures rather than wood, because wood would rot under those hot, humid conditions. I've mentioned about the first commercial dyestuffs, okay? Waddington is very clear about the benefits of synthetic dyes. You don't need as much, so you don't need massive storage for them. They're provided in tins, they're cheaper. You don't need to prepare them in any way, because remember, after a dye wood has been rasped or cut, it's then still got to be used properly and treated and placed in a bag and removed from the dye bath, etc., etc. So this was a revelation. But it was also a time of change for the dyers. There were new techniques that had to be found, new techniques that had to be made. Okay. Waddington gives a really, really good description of one of the sales reps who came around to sell synthetic dyestuffs to Waddington's. While Perkin had developed the first commercial dyestuffs, and we had some dye companies in the UK, the Germans really, really flooded the market. They flooded it by sending people in vast quantities to come and talk to the actual dyestuff manufacturers. They produced the most wonderful dye books with a multitude of different colours and a multitude of different dye wares that could be used to produce all manner of colours. As I've said, not all really colour fast, but wow, what an option in comparison to what was available beforehand. Theodore Siegler from the Bayer Company became a good friend of James Coote Waddington, okay? Edwin talks about him and his father talking about the unrest in Germany before World War I, which was to have an impact on the dyeing industry in Leeds because of the lack of dyestuffs available. And Theodore was actually interned at the Rothwell Company of Leeds at the outbreak of war. Edwin mentions that billiard and bagatelle cloths were a speciality for Waddington's, yeah? And Theodore informed them of a new type of aniline dye, which Waddington in his book actually says it was superb because it was faster than anything they had been able to do before and much easier to apply, okay? And also that it had the unusual property of being the same colour in gaslight as in daylight. The first colour constant dye available. But there's another bit that unfortunately Edwin didn't know. And when I was at work today, I had a look at the colour index, the first edition in 1924. And unfortunately, taking a look and finding imperial green, the description of imperial green is that it is a cupric acetoarsenite. Unfortunately, this great green for billiard cloths and bagatelle cloths was going to be poisoning everybody who was using it. And there's actually a big issue at the moment about what we do about having things with arsenic in them for book bindings and within dyes and prints, okay? When I talked previously about the rise in dyers and cleaners, the most important dyers and cleaners in Leeds, because of the lack of fastness from the actual new dyes, is Crockett cleaners, okay? And if you're of a certain age, you remember Crockett cleaners. Crockett cleaners started as dyers and cleaners. They actually are related to somebody called Puller, and Puller of Perth was the first gentleman who gave William Henry Perkin his first chance of dyeing mauve. The two are related. And I have the pleasure of knowing James Crockett, because we're both in the worshipful company of dyers. And James Crockett tells me that he remembers his granddad, who can remember meeting William Henry Perkin. Yeah. So for me, it's actually quite important to only be 3 steps away from William Henry Perkin. In 1874, and you can see how this all fits in, we've suddenly got synthetic dyestuffs. The city as a whole is growing in terms of the industries that it's got. We've got new churches. We've got a vast number of new physicians in the city. We want to be seen as a city when we're still a town. And the great and the good of Yorkshire, and it's important to state that this wasn't just about the great and the good of Leeds. It wasn't just about Gott putting money into this, etc., etc. It was some of the big textile manufacturers in Halifax and Huddersfield and Batley and elsewhere. They decided to support Yorkshire College of Science. So the forerunner of Leeds University, it's 150 years old today, okay? I know from looking at reports of it all, Mr. Chadwick and Bowman Lane definitely attended it. They had difficulty raising £60,000, but hey, it was done in the end. But the only department at the beginning, department of note to textiles was textile industries. Colour chemistry didn't come till 4 years later, okay? Which is interesting. Again, I think because dyeing wasn't that important within Leeds, but it was in the bigger context of things. It wasn't yet seen as an industry by itself. And textiles wasn't necessarily seen as a scientific endeavour anyway. Yeah, and it wasn't for many years by the university. Textile industries initially had 7-day students and 20 evening students, okay? And Wood and Bedford, who were to end up forming Yorkshire Dyewares, donated only £25, which is quite scary. This is a very important, I'm going to pick out some things from this rather than everything. You can read through it. It didn't have a professor, the textile industry department, it had an instructor. Yeah, the other 3 departments did have professors. But a big part of the growth of textile industry in both colour chemistry is the involvement of the Worshipful Company of Cloth Workers, who initially gave £10,000 for the textile industries department. And that's, we've all seen the blue plaque at Leeds. Me and Christine both went there and studied for 6 years, whatever. Yeah. It's a great building, and you can see how it really grew, the whole point about this. Waddington says that his father was on the actual Yorkshire College Dyeing Committee when it was formed, okay, which was in 1876. But there's no mention ever of them giving money to the actual department or to the growth of the whole place, okay? It turns out that the actual colour chemistry department, or the dyeing department as it was heavily influenced by Mr. Ripley of Ripley Dye Works in Bradford, which by that time, as I've said, was the biggest dye house in the whole world and really did stretch over a wide area using vast quantities of coal, vast quantities of water, okay? Mr. Ripley was a founding member of the Society of Dyers and Colourists, and subsequently he would be SDC president, okay? we were set up for the reading of scientific papers in the tinctorial industries. So it's no surprise that Mr. Ripley, on setting up the dyeing department, also wished to establish a course in dyeing that incorporates chemistry, physics, mechanics. We're going down the scientific route. In 1879 to 1980, J.J. Hummel was brought in as the instructor, okay? And of note, for me anyways, that in 1882, I think there was the first scientific paper out of the Department of Tinctorial Chemistries. And that was by a certain Mr. A.G. Perkin, Arthur Green Perkin. He was actually the son of William Henry Perkin. And he would end up being head of department at some point in his career. And another point to note is the fact that at some point, A.G. Perkin married the daughter of Mr. Bedford, who would go on to form Yorkshire Dyewear Company. The connections are all there and they all make sense. So let's go to where it ended. There's lots more we could say. If you want to have a read of the book and leaf through it, please do. Just talk about people coming and asking for money because Pontefract race had started up and it was a vice that shouldn't be allowed as far as the Waddingtons were concerned. But that's other things. There was a slump in business which Waddington puts down to being to do with the Ramsay MacDonald government. There was no recovery around 1937. Edwin and Charles retired and they decided to form a limited company, which must have been to protect their own money, which they'd amassed over the time. Okay, in 1938, a traffic circus was constructed on East Street and Marsh Lane, and that's again an image from Leo of the work happening. And that's just next door to where the dye house was, because they were next door to Hudson's. Okay. And in 1942, by order of Board of Trade, Waddington Dye House plus others in the district were closed down. I think it just meant that they'd gone bankrupt. I think that's where they were, and the Board of Trade must have had something to do with it. Okay. Some of the orders were passed on to other dye works which hadn't closed, and I'm assuming their ones up Sheepscar and down Kirkstall Road. And the actual date of closure was February 28th, 1942, when the company was wound up. Now, of note, Edwin Waddington makes the point that the two dye houses and equipment had been in use since 1816, a total of 31 years. He makes a specific point that they are still using lead oval pans and the stone troughs. I can show you Hummel's book from 1886, which gives a description of what dye baths should have looked like in 1886, never mind 1942. But part of me does wish I had been alive and old enough to walk in there to see what it was like, because it must have been like walking in the past. And I've been in some bad dye houses in my time. Okay. To keep the business going, they would have had to have invested a lot of money, new equipment, dye vessels, gearing, winches, and it was too much. Okay. Edwin Dean Waddington joins Bullis and Company on Meanwood Road. Okay. And I've forgotten the name of the person. One other of the nephews joins Bullis in 1950. Now, I had the pleasure of going into Bullis and Company in approximately 1988. I don't know whether either of these two gentlemen would have still been alive. I've still got to work it out. But I stood by one of their winches applying a dye stuff. One of the very, very first jobs that I did. It was a sorry state of the dye house at that time. It was horrible. It was dirty. It was dank. So it's hardly surprising that it only survived till 1997. But I'm going to leave the final thoughts from actual Edwin, okay? He says that no worker was ever discharged in the 80 years of Waddington's owning the factory, and many had served 50 years. He also, quite scaringly, talks about the disgust with which he sees where his workers are living when he gives them their prizes for having worked for him for 40 years and the destitute conditions on bank in which they live, at which point I can only think, pay your workers more. But that's another thing. He talks laconically of what it was like in the early days. In the early days of Waddington's, breakfast and dinner could be taken on the riverbank in fine weather when the air was a comparatively clean stream. I would have liked to have seen that. It would have been nice to have experienced that. And in bad weather, because Waddingtons were one of the first people to actually install a boiler, in bad weather, meals could be taken in the boiler house where food could be warmed up. They didn't add any washing facilities until 1890, which is pretty abysmal if you ask me, because it is a dirty job. And he says one of the highlights for his workers was when they did move to the new premises at Crown Point, and how much joy it brought that the men were now working under a covered archway, especially when it was snowing and the fabric was solid and they had to lay it out to inspect it. I'm sure there were better things that his workers could have felt good about rather than just that. But the conditions under which they worked, it really gives a feeling of the conditions under which the people actually worked. Okay. But Edwin says James Coote Waddington was the driving force behind the company. When he joined his father as a 12-year-old, he was told to learn to work and learn at work. And it was a mantra that he followed until he retired. Edwin says his choice of wife helped. And James Coote never forgot to tell all and sundry about how his wife was the most important part of his business for letting the rest of the family work efficiently. And not surprisingly, Edwin describes his father as a man of moderation with no toleration for the 3 Bs, beer, Backer and Betty, dismissing them as non-essential for life. Which may be true, but I don't agree with him. So, dyeing in the centre of Leeds has gone. It's never coming back, and we'd never want it back based on the majority of current techniques that are taking place. It would be nice to have some industry back around Leeds or around this area. But the future of dyeing is still being looked at in Leeds. Unfortunately, not in the colour chemistry department at Leeds, because the textile industries and the colour chemistry department were merged a few years ago to form the Leeds Institute of Textiles and Colour. But researchers up at Leeds are still looking at environmental impact of dyes, finding new ways of dyeing, chemical safety. They're looking at alternative sources of dye stuffs from food waste, and some food waste is being used as hair dyes. They're looking at ways of dyeing cloth with no water, supercritical CO2. And they're looking for new routes to actually produce both those dye stuffs which aren't based on fossil fuels, plus the auxiliaries that go with them. And they're working on collaborative projects. So one that I know that I am involved in as well is the Biocolours project at the University of Helsinki, which involves both North Carolina State University and Leeds University and the SDC. So the future's bright in terms of colour research and where it's going. Leeds is still viewed as a centre of excellence in terms of colour globally through the department, okay? But not just in dye chemistry, it can be in pigment chemistry, it can be in specialist dyes for medical end uses, or it can be the assessment of colour for various uses, okay? So Leeds still has a future in dyeing and dyeing, but now leading the world to do a better job than it's doing at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for a fascinating talk. We've got a few minutes for questions. Rachel, will you keep an eye on anybody in the chat? Because if you do want to ask questions on Zoom, type them into chat and we'll pick them up. But first, questions from the floor here. Gentleman there.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, I enjoyed the talk hugely. I better just, my name's John Cruikshank, and I better fess up that I'm in the process of trying to write up a history of textile industries in Yorkshire before the Industrial Revolution.
Okay,
And obviously much of what you've been looking at here is from 1802, 1816 onwards. And you latched onto a variety of things that James Hay, he was a dyer and cleaner, as revealed on his title page.
okay,
So he was already using that name. He wasn't a Leeds man.
right,
He trained in London, which is where he got the Frenchified habit and the Frenchified
okay,
recipes.
right,
But what he does do in an appendix to that book, published a couple of years later, just as he was in the process of dying himself, dying with an R.
right,
Was the how did it phrase? Advice to the dyer and well worth the attention of the merchant, or something like that, which is a magnificently bitchy,
yes,
almost counterweight to his rather academic initial book. The book was originally published in Manchester, but was extensively advertised in the Leeds newspapers,
right,
which gives all sorts of handles on the book, him and his dye works in Kirkwood.
okay,
So he was in Kirkwood. The Bowman Lane dye works is older than you think.
right.
John, would you like to come up and talk through into the microphone, because otherwise the people online won't be able to hear.
Should we talk off? Should we
Yeah,
talk after
I think it
this?
might be necessary
Right.
to carry on the
Yeah.
There are
conversation.
all sorts of additional, I mean, you've got some marvelous stuff here. There's all sorts of additional things I'd like to discuss with you.
Love to.
Things I want to pick your brains about.
Right.
Somebody else.
There's-
I'll ring my wife and tell her I'm not coming home.
Fantastic.
Questions?
There don't seem to be any messages here asking questions, so feel free, anybody else?
Yeah, Phil.
Thank you. Somewhere you talk about the vast amounts of natural dye material that was needed. I've got it in my mind that regarding cochineal, it used to take 70,000 female cochineals to make 1 kilogram of
That's
dye.
correct.
Is that, as far as you know, right?
That's what I've seen.
So just say, for those who've done.
Can you repeat it?
Yeah, could you perhaps just repeat it quickly?
Oh, sorry,
what the
yeah,
question
Bill
says?
just said that he's seen various places where it says that 70 kilos of female cochineal insects were needed to produce 1 kilo of dyestuffs. And that seems to be about right. But obviously it all depended on where the cochineal came from, what the conditions were like at the time of the cochineal beetle growing. So I'm assuming at some points there was very little colour coming out of them, and sometimes there was more. So it could be larger quantities. But that 1 kilo of dye was not very pictorially strong either. So to dye a piece of cloth, which might be however much, you're possibly needing 10 kilos of the dye. Yeah. Which then makes 700 kilos of cochineal beetles to dye 1 piece of fabric, which then just becomes phenomenal. And it's no wonder that whole colonies of cochineal beetles were decimated from the Balearics, from the Canary Islands, and the merchants searched for where they could get it, and they were never good at maintaining the levels of cochineal beetles. Yeah.
Was the in years ago when we used to make icing for cakes pink, we used cochineal colouring?
Yeah.
Was that the real stuff, or
Cochineal was used for coloration. The problems occurred when the synthetic dye stuff manufacturers decided to sell synthetic dye stuffs, which were highly poisonous as natural cochineal, which then ended up killing loads of people. And nobody ever knew why, because it was put down to other things rather than the dye stuffs. Yeah.
John Cruikshank again.
Yeah.
I was just going to chip in with a sort of parallel comment on the quantities of dyestuffs involved. If you look in the Leeds newspapers for the mid-18th century, the dyewoods being advertised for auction were being advertised in lots. The small lots were half a ton.
Yeah.
Large lots were several tons. You commented that you know they were big pieces of wood they were dealing with.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Okay.
And they were being. There was one advert which said that they, for the ease of small businessmen or something, they were going to sell them in lots as small as half a ton.
Yeah.
It's a lot of stuff was
Yeah.
coming to Leeds.
And on something like logwood, what I'm really interested in finding, because the amount of space that was required to condition it is probably as good a word as I can use, yeah, which needed to be done, must have been vast, must have been enormous. And yet there is some evidence from Lancashire of the size of a mill down one of the valleys, because somebody else has done some research. And that was a mill that was specifically laid out, a large mill, if you can imagine a large mill in 1870 in Lancashire. It was specifically laid out just to condition logwood. And it doesn't make sense to me, but we need to find out.
What colour were they using the logwood for? Black or green? Or blue?
Blue mostly rather than black.
Because logwood blues were made illegal.
Yeah, I've got that in my notes here. Up until 1660.
Yeah, and the Leeds manufacturers managed to get that prohibition reversed because logwood blues were quite profitable.
Yeah.
If not stable.
Oh yeah, it reduced the price. Well, logwood was that much better than woad for producing a blue. It wasn't as good a blue, or that's what was claimed.
It faded. The colour changed on exposure to light.
Well, that's why later on it tended just to be used on top of a colour.
I think we've got a couple of questions in chat, so I cut through this just so that
There's a question, there's a comment from somebody who's hugely grateful for a fascinating talk and a little interesting thing there. And as the 19th century ended, did you see an interest in dyes from the leather industry, which was building new tanneries such as kitchens?
Mike, I'd love to turn around to you and say that I did actually look into the dyes for the leather industry, but I haven't, Mike. Okay, I've kept it very much to textiles. I know you've got an interest in tanneries from your time, but it's something that needs to be looked at, and we certainly know that the same dyes were used between the two, and some of the same products were used in the tanning industry as there were in the dyeing industry. So maybe it's something you want to take up, Mike.
There we are. So it's 7:15.
I think we should probably draw to a close. To say once again, thank you very much, Andrew, for that. It was a fascinating talk, an area I know nothing about, certainly not in the terms of the Leeds trade. So thank you for enlightening all of us.
Thank you very much.
So our next meeting is a couple of weeks' time.
Yes, we've got another meeting on the 21st of May, which is about a climate scientist's work turning himself into an artist inspired by the locations where he does his scientific work. And then we've got 2 talks in June, one on the 7th of June, the night before the 300th birthday of John Smeaton, and that's out at St Mary's, Whitkirk. And then we've got Jane's talk about Lady Elizabeth Butler and her art, and that's going to be at the Leeds Art Gallery on a lunchtime in June. I think that's the 20th of June, isn't it? Yes. Good, so I hope to see some of you there. I will now attempt to...
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no,
Okay.